Hi, everybody. So welcome. It's really nice to see you, even though I can't see you. Anyway, my name is Evan Ashworth. I'm a lecturer here in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the University of New Mexico, and this is the third of the last of the workshops that I am offering this spring 2025 semester, but I hope to continue to offer these workshops in subsequent semesters. So again, thank you for being here, whether it's over the live stream or you're watching this as a recording on our department's YouTube channel. Either way, it means that you have a vested interest in teaching, and I want to thank you for that because that is at the center of everything that I do as a lecturer, and indeed has informed the topic that I'll be speaking about today. So I'm going to be speaking about the importance of a lesson plan and how to make the most of that lesson plan. So the title I sort of recognize almost sounds like a motivational speaking title, but it really is about how to make the most of the lesson plans you use for any class that you teach. And just as a note, this presentation is being recorded. So just as an overview, in this workshop, I'm going to talk about a few different things. First, I'm going to spend a few moments just kind of contextualizing the role of a teacher in the classroom, and then I'll talk more about the lesson plan as an overview, what is intended to do. Then next, I'm going to explore some of the factors that will inevitably affect student learning, and there are a great number of them, some of which we have control over in our classroom as teachers, and some we have absolutely no control over. But then actually after that, I'm going to talk about some of these components that go into the lesson plan. And when I say components, they're really synonymous with teaching methods like lecture, group discussions, class discussions, reflection, and so forth. After that, I'm going to talk about time management strategies and how we can take the factors that we will have discussed, as well as these teaching methods, and figure out how for a 75-minute classroom, there's sort of sensible use of time where you're balancing each of these teaching methods and not, for example, relying on just one, typically the lecture. After that, I'm going to just talk about one example of a different model that is generally referred to as flipped classroom pedagogy. And this is just a different, well, it's an alternative to the more traditional classroom-based instruction that I'm going to be talking about today. After that, I'll just be happy to address any questions that you might have as audience members. All right, so first, let me just take a moment and talk about the role of a teacher here before I even talk about lesson plans, because I think it's important to contextualize this conversation. So I feel like throughout my life, I've been something of a dog chasing a car, and in this analogy, I'm the dog, but the car is teaching, and it's this moving target that I've always been interested in and attracted to, much like dogs kind of like cars and might chase after them. So here I am, and it's a horrible attempt at a meme, but I often feel like when I'm teaching a class, especially if it's a class that I don't have a lot of experience teaching or no experience teaching, that I'm a dog behind the wheel of a car and I don't know how to drive it. So I'm really happy that I caught that car, but I have a lot of, well, problems actually getting that car moving on the road. So now I feel like, based on my experience and some scholarship that I'll be talking about throughout this presentation, I am able to now get my license and get this car driving, but maybe I'm not the most effective driver yet. So let me talk about what our role is as teachers here in 2025. Obviously, we call ourselves teachers or instructors, but more to the point, I think we're all, as educators, rhetoricians. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, and I cannot think of a better example of speakers as rhetoricians than teachers, because even if we're just talking to our students about concepts in public speaking or in communication research methods or interviewing, whatever it might be, we're persuading our students why they need to learn these concepts and why they perhaps are best served to learn the concepts in the way that we teach them. So even though we may not think of ourselves as engaging in the practice of rhetoric or argumentation, I would push back and say that is absolutely what we are doing as teachers every single class. And that we're also clearly public speakers, but we're public speakers using an audience-centered approach. And so for those of you who might have taught public speaking and you're struggling with an example for how to show students what audience-centered public speaking looks like, you're doing it as a teacher, because responsive teachers in the classroom have to monitor what their students are doing. Verbally, non-verbally, we get a sense of whether or not students understand the concepts that we're passing on to them, or they're really struggling with the concepts. And this might just be really subtle facial expressions, or the posture that they demonstrate in their chairs, or just how many students are present in a given class period. We need to take all of this data as speakers, and that will inform our delivery, or how we talk about these concepts. We're also performers, though, and maybe, well, there's less performance for some teachers than others, but I must acknowledge that even though I'm the director of the public speaking program in our department here at UNM, every time I go to teach, I kind of have to put on a persona. I'm a performer, I'm an entertainer, a comedian, it seems at times. And this is something that I think all teachers can identify with. Even if we don't feel energetic or happy, we have to put on that face, because this is what our students expect from us. In addition to that, especially this time of the semester, is we might find ourselves serving as de facto therapists, where students come to talk to us not just about their struggles with the classes they're taking, but maybe their difficulties just taking other classes to get their degree as undergraduates. And so we often find ourselves as a kind of shoulder for students to cry on, maybe often literally at times, right? So we have to navigate all of these multiple roles as teachers, and it could be a really challenging thing to do. I wanted to just spend a moment talking about that, because this is really important when it comes to building a lesson plan, is remembering that we're performers, we're therapists, we're public speakers, and this informs how we should develop our lesson plan. So let me start in talking about the lesson plan by building this bridge between who we are as educators and what we should be doing in the classroom. And this diagram is Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom was basically a figure in the 1950s who led this committee of they were tasked by the U.S. Department of Education at the time to think about solutions for goals that we can establish in terms of making outcomes for student learning. And so this is well known in education circles, but maybe not so much to you, and this is why I want to share it, because Bloom's taxonomy is what I would argue all teachers have to address, regardless of the concepts that they're teaching. So at the very bottom of this image here, we have knowledge and comprehension. And the language that's in this image of a light bulb here are just verbs. So I'm using this image to express this idea that we want students to do things ultimately at the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. We want them to be able to analyze and synthesize and evaluate their work and others' work. But it maybe starts at the lower end here. So being able to remember information, being able to understand facts and that information, and then being able to apply it to real-world situations. So I might, for example, start every class with really easy questions where I'm asking them to define a concept, to think about that concept, and maybe to discuss it in groups. But by the end of the class, and certainly by the end of the semester, I want students to be creating original, new work, and to have the confidence to be able to examine their work and others through a critical lens. So Bloom's taxonomy serves as a really useful model, as a kind of guidepost for where educators should be heading. That it's not enough to just have students remember information, to be able to regurgitate facts and stats on a quiz, for example, but to be able to apply the skills they learn and come up with creative solutions. So problem solving, this is something that really all disciplines have to deal with. It doesn't matter what they are, and that sort of problem solving is addressed in the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So let's talk a little bit about the lesson plan now, and how this is really a balancing act. So when I say a lesson plan, just in terms of a conceptual definition here, I really think of a lesson plan as an outline for a day's class. This term lesson plan may have really old school connotations and really formal ideas, but for me, it's just kind of giving me a roadmap for how I'm going to explain a concept to a class. And I also think of it as a sort of daily student learning objective. As I'll share in a little while, it's generally, I think, a good thing to err on the side of covering less rather than more. And if you're covering just a few concepts fully and substantively, students will learn that much more effectively rather than just all of the information that you might want to unload on them in one class because you feel like that's the only time to do it. So when you're developing a lesson plan, it's important, I think, to ask yourself these three questions. What do you want to accomplish in that class period? What can reasonably be accomplished? And that might be really difficult if you're teaching just a 50-minute class, but even in a 75-minute class, that's not that much time. So you have to think about realistically what can be done in that time. And then in terms of the logistics, what do you actually need in order to do that in terms of technology or in terms of activities, the use of space in creative ways? All of this as teachers, if we've done this for the first time, we know how difficult it can be. And that once you teach a class for the second time, it gets so much easier because you've already at least got a draft of a lesson plan that you've already used at some point. So I'd just like to sort of define a lesson plan and why it's important, because I think a lot of instructors maybe don't know that they're already using a lesson plan, or they feel like they don't even need one and they can just improvise it. And I'll get into why that is perhaps dangerous and risky. So let me start with this diagram that I show students in my public speaking class, but I'm revisiting this diagram now for you all as teachers because it has the same relevance. And I also want to have this conversation in terms of the number of factors that will affect student learning in our classroom, both in a face-to-face brick and mortar classroom and also in the online asynchronous classroom. So first, let's just take the context itself, this very broad context. Now, immediately we could say that there is the classroom. That is the context, whether it's a face-to-face classroom in the communication and journalism building at UNM or it's an online class, whatever. But context includes a number of different things here. And I'm thinking about the geopolitical climate. I'm thinking about the weather. Those are things that we don't have much, if any, control of whatsoever. But they are factors that will affect student learning. And so it's part of this broader context. If we look at the source, we could consider the source the speaker or the teacher. And so every time we're in class and we're talking about a concept, we're going to have a concept that we need to encode, which is to say put it in the form of a message. And here we have other factors that will affect student learning. The language that's being used, the dialect that's being spoken by that teacher, perhaps the use of slang that is used by students or the teacher, and how some slang might not be understood by one party or the other. But we have to take this message and we have to encode it. And it goes through a channel. And for face-to-face brick and mortar classrooms, that's face-to-face, relying on verbal communication, but also nonverbal communication. In an online class, the channel is different because you're working through the medium of a computer. But the student, who is the receiver in this diagram, has to decode that. So as we know as educators, we try to come up with useful language and examples that we think will clarify a concept for students, but sometimes we might end up saying the equivalent of the most important development of early hominids was the engagement in lithic acquisitional events. So I might have encoded that in a way that might be clear to me as a scholar, but to the student who's decoding that doesn't make any sense. So I should probably reword it to something like, it's really important for human beings to learn how to use rocks as tools. All right, that might not work for the kind of language that you see in a peer-reviewed scholarly journal in archaeology, but it's the sort of language that students really rely on to be able to understand a concept in its simplest terms and its clearest terms. Now, we also have the student as the receiver who's providing feedback. And this can largely be done non-verbally in the classroom, and, well, maybe it's totally invisible in an online asynchronous classroom because we don't know what students are really struggling with until they come to us with questions. But in a face-to-face classroom, we might notice these sorts of non-verbals, back-channeling, like nodding of the head, a sort of defensive posture, maybe a student literally sleeping because they're tired or we're really boring in the stuff that we're talking about, right? And again, this reinforces the practice of teaching as an audience-centered public speaking approach. We really need to take the signs from our students and use those to inform our message as educators. So Also, just keep in mind the noise that will affect the channel or ultimately this whole context and teaching sort of interaction. And this noise could be internal or external. Students have internal noise, and certainly this time of the semester where they are stressed out, they are thinking about their other classes that they need to pass in order to graduate, and how little time they have to complete all of these remaining assignments. What are they going to eat for dinner? What are they going to do this weekend, right? These are all examples of internal noise. But there's also the external noise, quite literally the noise that we hear when we're in the classroom, whether it's the sound of the furnace in the building or the fact that there's sirens going down Central, which we're very close to in the communication and journalism department. I'm not saying this to confuse you, hopefully, but I want to try to impart this idea that there are so many moving parts that we often forget about when we're teaching in a classroom. And these are all factors that affect student learning to a lesser or a greater extent. And some of these we have control over, some of them we don't, or very little control. So let me then talk a little bit about some of these factors. And this is where, again, I must acknowledge that the format of this presentation is more of a presentation. But I would like to invite you to think of this more of a workshop. And what that would mean is that you're taking out a syllabus, or more for this presentation, you're taking out a recent lesson plan or two, and just thinking about how you structured that lesson for that day, whether it was yesterday, 2 weeks ago, a year ago, whatever it is. So I'd really encourage you, as I'm talking, to take out a recent lesson plan and just think about some of these factors. Let's talk about those first. So I mentioned some of these, like, well, the course that you teach, the class topic for that day, because some topics are just much easier to discuss than others, but it's all part of the same class in public speaking or communication research methods, right? The classroom itself, what kind of physical space do you have? Some of the classrooms are relatively small, intimate environments where students are really close to one another, and then other classrooms I've taught in, and you as well perhaps, they're much bigger and students maybe want to spread out and use that space. And so these are really important factors, I think, that we actually do have some control over as educators. Now, maybe not a ton, maybe you can't get a new classroom, but you can rearrange the seats in the classroom. You can use space in that classroom in a way that suits your needs. Don't feel like you have to keep the seating arrangements from the previous class, right? These are things that will affect student learning. So if you want to try to foster a productive discussion in class, a lot of teachers will prefer to just have the seats in a circle as a sort of panopticon where everybody can see everybody else. And even though initially that might sound intimidating, it just is a more inviting environment for having a conversation rather than the sort of teacher at the front of the classroom with everybody in rows towards the back. It also positions yourself as a non-expert that you're willing to learn from your students, and we hope that you are, because I would argue this is one of the most important parts of teaching, is being open to learning from your students. So some of these factors are more powerful than others, and I'm just thinking, for example, about the geopolitical climate right now. This is going to stress a lot of students out, and it will affect their thoughts about the future in securing scholarships or whether they want to enter into a certain discipline, attend graduate school in certain places of the country or world. Again, it's a big source of stress for some students, and that is unfortunately stuff that we have very little, if no, control over as teachers in the classroom. But there are some things that we could perhaps do about that, and I'll talk to you about that in a second, like the importance of an icebreaker and conversations at the beginning of every class. But all of these factors that I mentioned in that diagram before and that are mentioned here, they're stuff to think about because they will all affect student learning. I want to talk a little bit now just about resources here, and this is a brief aside, but it goes into building a good lesson plan. And I just want to share what has been, for me, a really important resource. This is a book that's written by John Bean well over 20 years ago, but it's a classic, and that's why I'm sharing it with you. It's called Engaging Ideas. And so this is very briefly something that I feel is really important to me as an educator, is this idea of writing across the curriculum, and Bean talks about this in his book. Writing across the curriculum is the idea, perhaps like it sounds by the term, but the idea that writing should not be relegated to traditionally writing-intensive disciplines like English. that there's a place for writing in every class, even a math class, even a public speaking class, because Bean and others, including myself, would argue that writing is not just a means of communicating information, it's a means of learning. And so there's this expression like, I wish I'd learned to write a little bit better. And maybe we all have these feelings, but I would also turn that around and say, yes, but we could also use writing to learn. And more concretely, you can see this as like note-taking strategies. When you're taking a difficult class, you're going to take notes to maybe remember complex terminology or verb paradigms in a foreign language. You're going to use notes that you can then revisit, right? That's part of it, though. I think that's actually the tip of the iceberg. I would argue, as Bean does, that the more you engage in the writing process, the more that you're able to actually formulate thoughts in a way that you can then communicate them, not just in writing, but also in speaking to others. So this is why Bean and others argue that writing is really important. Yes, it is a technology and one that is definitely valued in Western models of education, but it is something that if you already have a lifetime of experience with literacy, then it's something that you could be using at the university level, not just as a way to like learn information or again to communicate information, but by writing you're actually learning that information more effectively. And those of you who might have written a research paper in your early undergraduate years and then later on doing this sort of process again, you could probably reflect on how much better you understand the process having gone through it once. Writing it all for the first time is a really new thing that students do in my communication research methods class. And by writing, you're engaging in this process of scientific research in a more honest way. So as Bean has also argued here, and this is touching on the comments that I made in my last workshop about how you respond to student work and providing feedback, is just to keep in mind that when we're reviewing student work inside the class or outside the class, I would argue our concern should be at the higher level, the higher order concerns here. The content of one's argument, their organization, the tone that they're taking, the accuracy of this information. That takes a lot of work. You have to do a lot of reading to kind of sort out whether or not there are flaws, fallacies in a person's argumentation. It's very easy to just glance at a paper and notice, oh, there's spelling errors, there's punctuation and grammar errors. So even though that might be the first thing that we notice, those are much more lower order concerns, these kind of surface level grammar and spelling issues. So I'm not saying that they are meaningless. They do have meaningful consequences, unfortunately, in applying for jobs. If you misspell things on your resume, your employer is probably much less likely to hire you. But when you're doing a research paper, you're just exploring ideas and writing, you don't need to emphasize that stuff, in my opinion. The emphasis should be on these higher order concerns. So I just want to encourage you to take a look at this book because it offers a number of different resources and justifications for these. And also there is a whole chapter on how you respond to student work. So it's a really fantastic resource. Even though it's an old book, it's still relevant and applicable today in 2025. So let's now talk a little bit about these components of the lesson plan, and then we're going to talk about how we can use time management wisely to balance these components or teaching methods. So the first thing let's talk about here is the icebreaker. This is something that I really didn't used to do at all as a teacher, and that was as little as a few years ago. In the last few years, I've really understood the importance of reserving time for an icebreaker, especially in a post-COVID face-to-face classroom. So different people will do this in different ways. I kind of start out each class, as my colleagues know, with a really bad dad joke or two. And then I'm going to ask my students if they have any dad jokes. And so the reason why I found this as a useful model is because of the sort of cultural following that dad jokes generally have. Everybody knows what a dad joke is. They're funny, maybe they're groan-worthy, but they're always kind of worth conversation, I think, and they always bring levity into a classroom. And I think the best time to do that is right at the beginning. So even though we tend to think of an icebreaker activity as like something that you do for the first time when you meet somebody that you've never met before, or you're trying to get a workshop started for the first time, or a conference presentation, you might do an icebreaker activity. But more to the point, I actually think these icebreakers should be done every single class. Because just keep in mind where your students are coming from. They have a number of other classes before or after yours. They're very tired, and you need to spend at least a few minutes every day reorienting them, just getting them comfortable talking. And for me, dad jokes is a good source of doing this. And by asking, hey, do you all have any dad jokes? Inevitably, they will come up. People might be looking for them on their phone, or they're sharing things that they've heard. So you're already getting students talking. You're getting them warmed up. This is just what I do, but you can do icebreakers and other things too. Another idea, and this is kind of why it's important to do this, is there's a number of things that students might want to talk about before class anyway. And as I mentioned in my previous workshop, the 3, 4, 5 minutes you have before class is, I think, really invaluable time, because this is when you get to just talk to your students and build rapport with them, which you then reinforce with an icebreaker. But you might notice that students are talking about maybe geopolitical concepts and that you might want to revisit that. I remember, for example, in 2018, after the school shooting in Florida, that my students were already talking about that the day after, so we spent a good 15, 20 minutes just talking about campus safety. And so, again, it's the audience-centered public speaking approach, being really responsive to what your students are talking about and understanding when you need to also talk about those concepts with your students. This is a really important thing that I just would gloss over for a long time as a teacher, and I've been teaching since a long time. But it's only in the last few years that I've understood the importance of these icebreakers. So make sure to do that, and I think the best time to do that is really at the beginning of class, possibly at the end as well though. But leaving time for announcements and questions. Obviously there's going to be logistics that you need to address, possibly every class, announcing upcoming scholarship, reminding students of deadlines, and just asking if students have any questions, because very often students do have questions, but maybe they don't know that they have license to ask them until you tell them, yes, please give me questions, right? So once you have an icebreaker and announcements and questions, you might already have 15 minutes of your class gone. And then in a 75-minute class, you've only basically got an hour of instruction. So I would still say that these things you absolutely have to do, because it's going to make the subsequent hour go much more smoothly, rather than just diving into your lecture, for example, or even an in-group activity without first kind of contextualizing the class and doing that icebreaker and announcements first. Now, in terms of the teaching methods or components, depending on how you think of them, I want to argue that teachers should be triangulating their methods just like researchers do. So responsible researchers, if they have a research question, they know that they're not going to rely on just one method to answer that research question. So, for example, if there was a researcher who wanted to explore the impact of pollutants in water systems in New Mexico, it's not enough to just study the chemicals in the water and perform experiments in the soil and so forth. Absolutely necessary to do all of that, but maybe we need the more qualitative component where we talk to community members and we interview them. We conduct surveys where we're getting the human element of this data, what it is like to live in their shoes in a community that is dealing with polluted water, right? So all of this is to say, as an example, researchers, if they want a complete picture of an answer to their research question, they're going to use multiple methods to get at that research question and answer it. The same thing applies to teaching. So one of the most common methods of teaching that some instructors rely too much on or entirely is the lecture. It's a very easy thing to do, and it's a very tempting thing to do for somebody who might have worked long and hard for their master's degree and or PhD degree, and they just want to wax poetic, and they just love the sound of their voice, essentially. It's very easy to do that sort of thing, but it's also very easy, if you're a student, to become disengaged, because there have been there's been a lot of scholarship on this, that students don't learn best when they are relegated to the role of a passive observer. Even if the teacher is a really good lecturer, and they're really good at telling stories, and they are a clear communicator, it doesn't matter how well the student takes notes. They're just not going to learn the concepts as well because they're not actually doing it. They're not talking about these experiences with the peers around them. They're not engaging in problem solving. They're really just listening to what somebody else has to say. I'm not saying don't lecture ever, because that's often really useful or maybe even required, but to think about how you can minimize the lecture in your classroom. But there's other things that we can do here, and I'm thinking about this in terms of catering to our students' diverse learning styles. There are a number of them, and I'm just mentioning 3 here, but for example, if you're an auditory learner as a student, then that's where it is beneficial to have some lecture, to have some small group discussion, but also a class discussion. Auditory learners appreciate that. But there's also going to be a fair number of visual learners in your class, so maybe they're going to benefit from a PowerPoint. They really appreciate seeing videos that illustrate the concept that you're talking about, and why generally teachers should be using visual aids to keep students engaged, but especially for visual learners to help them understand concepts. Or using diagrams like the ones that I did a few moments ago. This is going to help students digest information more effectively if they're a visual learner. And then last, and not to, well, I don't know, maybe you might think it's a little bit weird here, but there are kinesthetic learners. Now, you might think, all right, but when would I be doing kinesthetic learning, say, in a communication classroom? More than you think. And this is what I mean when I say, when we get students just walking around the classroom or the building in which the classroom is housed, they're already doing a little bit of kinesthetic learning. And as weird as this might sound, the practice of writing, especially if it's by hand, is a kind of kinesthetic learning. As Miller and Oppenheimer, I think in 2014, and others have found, students are more effectively able to remember information, to understand information, if they are writing notes by hand rather than taking notes with a computer. So there's something about this kind of brain-hand connection that is reinforcing learning concepts when you're writing things down by hand rather than just typing keys in. So I invite you to take a look at that scholarship, because this is getting at this kinesthetic learning. And very generally, if you're doing a mix of these different things in even just one class, you're catering to the multiple learning styles that your students have there. So if for nothing else, you're breaking up the monotony. You're not relying on just one of these things where you're lecturing for 75 minutes or you're going to have only class discussions for 75 minutes. They can be really challenging, so I really invite you to think about how you can break up these different teaching methods in sensible ways, and as we'll talk about shortly, using time in a wise way, spending enough time, but not too much on a lecture, so to speak. So let's talk about this time management then, and this is, I think, one of the biggest logistical challenges that teachers face in the classroom. And this is where the ordering, first of all, is very important. And in a few moments, I'm going to share an example of what a lesson plan might look like for a 75-minute class, kind of working from the lower order concerns or lower order thinking in Bloom's taxonomy to the higher order thinking in Bloom's taxonomy. We'll get to that in a moment, but as you're building a lesson plan, especially if it's a class that you've not taught before, is to think about what makes sense in terms of getting students into the conversation. And this is, again, returning to this notion of an icebreaker. For many people, that's just like 1 minute, or just sort of, hey, how are you? How was your weekend? I think that's absolutely stuff you should be asking anyway, but I don't think it should stop there. I think you really should be having an honest conversation with your students for several minutes at the beginning of class. And of course, it will depend on how many students are there, the kind of personality and the chemistry of the students, because you'll get a sense, all right, we've exhausted, they're ready to go. Or maybe, no, we need to keep talking about this because my students want to keep talking, and this is a really important issue to them. So you might have only 5 minutes reserved for your icebreaker, but you might have decided, oh yeah, my students want to keep talking about it, this is important, we need to make this a 10 or maybe 15-minute conversation. But that icebreaker really should, I think, come first in a classroom. And maybe you can bookend it by including something like that last. But there's also this notion of a reflection. My colleagues who know me also know that I am a big proponent of using a reflection as a kind of teaching method. And I'll get to you a couple of examples of how to use a reflection in a moment. There's also the lecture component. But there's no reason why you can't break up that lecture into multiple parts. And so maybe you'll lecture for 5 or 10 minutes, and then you'll have students do a small group discussion. Then you'll come back to a lecture. Then you'll have them engage in a brief class discussion. So there's no reason why the lecture has to be this kind of monolithic chunk for 30 or 40 minutes. You can break it up, and you probably should break it up for maybe 10 minutes at a time. Just kind of given who we are as human beings, and we have kind of a short attention span, and it's easy for for students to kind of trail off and get disengaged when we're speaking for 20 or 30 minutes, like I'm doing in this presentation. Anyway, so just take as much time as you need to break the ice, and this is where you just have to judge who your students are, where they're coming from, what they want to talk about, and how important it is to talk about that stuff. But err on the side of covering less, not more. This is also something that took me some time to learn, but very often I'm a little bit too eager, too overzealous to cover too much content in one class period. And even though I teach at higher ed, I need to keep in mind that our students have enough classes that they're taking already. There's so much information that they're exposed to every day that even if it's just 2 or 3 really important things you want them to learn, just stick with those. And then if you happen to have time left over in class and students' energy levels are acceptable, then you're like, all right, maybe we will preview this concept or talk a little bit about it now, which we'll then talk more about in the next class. But as King 1993 and others have stated, when we're managing our time wisely and we're not relying entirely on lecture, then the role of a teacher is a little bit different. We're not so much a sage on the stage, so to speak, giving a lecture for all of the class or most of the class, but that our role as teachers is more of a guide on the side, something akin to like a tutor when we're asking students to engage in problem solving in class. And we'll talk about this with the flipped classroom pedagogy model in a little while here. So don't always feel like you need to be the one at the beginning of the class talking. Hopefully you don't feel that way, because our students need time and space to talk too, in small groups, one-on-one, and then as a big class. So be prepared, but be flexible. This is the sort of notion, not just of Murphy's Law, what kind of could fail, will go wrong in technology, to have a plan B, but also be flexible and just sort of know that anything logistical could pop up, whether it's a fire alarm that might happen as it did happen this week at our university, and that's going to change things and force you to reconsider what you can cover in class that day. Or maybe just sort of thinking about how many students might show up to class. And like yesterday, for example, there was a protest on campus, and so a lot of students were not in my class. And I understand that, and that's going to affect kind of what I'm talking about and how long I'm going to talk about it. So be prepared, but be flexible. So what I want to share now and spend a little bit of time talking about here is a possible lesson plan for a 75-minute class. And I'm using the 75-minute example because this is what we use in the Department of Communication and Journalism, and most classes use at UNM. But you can play with this a lot. Let me just kind of walk you through this by using an example that comes from public speaking, a class that I teach every semester. So in public speaking, one of my favorite parts of the semester is when I talk about persuasive speaking, when we ask students to not just give information about a topic, but to actually try to convince an audience to feel the way that they do about a topic. And so when I talk about persuasive communication and persuasive speaking, I want to focus on 3 really specific concepts, but they're pretty simple: logos, pathos, and ethos. I'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, at the beginning of this class, when I'm talking to my public speaking students about persuasive speaking, I'm going to spend maybe 5 minutes, or at least that's the idea that I have, where I'm sharing terrible dad jokes, I'm asking my students to do the same, and inevitably, it might vary from class to class to what extent students are warming up to these dad jokes and want to share some of their own. We know that the chemistry among our students and what makes for a vibe as good or bad in a class, it really can change from one class to another, right? But we do, regardless, want to have those 5 minutes, at least, I think, at the beginning of class, to just talk to our students, have them talk to you. Then we're making announcements. We're answering any questions that students might have about a previous assignment, about an upcoming assignment. And again, all of this might take 10 to 15 minutes, but it's still really important to do in every class, even if it cuts down on the amount of instruction time that you would otherwise have. So first, in this context of talking about persuasive speaking, I might have students just do an individual reflection exercise for a few minutes. And the words that I'm using here are define and describe. These are verbs that are used in the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Again, the lower levels are not to be avoided, you can use them. I do, but you don't rely on them because it's not enough to just memorize information or to understand it. I want them to be able to apply it, to synthesize the information, and to be able to evaluate their new work and others, right? But I have to kind of ease into that each class period and throughout the semester. So in this reflection activity, I might ask students to just define what makes something persuasive to you. Just a very general, broad question like that. Get them thinking and, again, get them writing, especially where I encourage them to take out a pen and a piece of paper. And if they don't have it, yeah, they could use their phone or their computer. But I'm a real proponent of handwriting here based on what I've just shared and the connections with the brain and kind of kinesthetic learning. So after this 5 minutes is done where they're defining and sort of describing what they think constitutes persuasive communication, well, then I'm going to have them go into maybe a class discussion. Like, let's talk about this as a big group here. What do you think is the criteria for a persuasive speech? So then they're explaining their ideas. They might be discussing it, maybe even defending it if another student's like, no, I disagree with that student. I have a different version. So you're having a brief conversation that students can defend their positions as to what constitutes persuasive speaking. Then after that is where maybe I'll go into a lecture for 10 minutes. So let me pause and say this has become my sort of model here where I love lecturing, let's be clear, but it's not the thing that I want to dive into first because students, I don't think they always appreciate that. They need to kind of warm up to the concept, talk about it a little bit, think a little bit about it, then talk about it, and then receive information from a lecture. So in talking about persuasive communication, this 10-minute chunk of time is where maybe I'll talk about logos, pathos, ethos, define them, give examples of them, so that students can see what they are. But then after that, I'm going to perhaps show a video. And what I do when I talk about persuasive speaking is show perhaps 2 infomercials. And one infomercial might be by Vince Offer talking about the slap chop. If you've not seen it, I'll let you watch at your own peril or enjoyment, whatever you like. But then another 5 minutes might be dedicated to looking at a totally different infomercial, like the one that is an ASPCA ad, or the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which stars Sarah McLachlan. So you may remember this infomercial. It's a pretty brief commercial, I think, actually, maybe 5 minutes long, but Sarah McLachlan is a singer, and so the song In the Arms of an Angel is playing in the background, overlaid of images of pets that are looking really sad or in need, and it's a very pathos-driven commercial, right? But if you look at the Slap Chop, which is also a commercial or an infomercial, it's not relying on pathos so much. It's relying more on ethos and logos. So I'm showing students these 2 videos, and then after that, I'm going to have them get into a group. So I'm not going back and talking. I want to have my students do the talking, and I have them do this in small groups where they're applying, they're analyzing. They've already watched these 2 infomercials, and I'm asking them to compare the 2, analyze sort of what sort of approach this speaker is using in this infomercial compared to what this other speaker in this other infomercial is doing with respect to logos, pathos, and ethos. So those 3 things, just logos, pathos, and ethos, they're pretty simple concepts that form the Aristotelian triangle, or what makes an argument, but that is something that is kind of exemplifying this take on less rather than more approach, so that students will be able to understand logos, pathos, and ethos really deeply, really substantively, because that is all you're talking about that day. But you got to be creative in how you're doing it with these different teaching methods. So after students have spent a few minutes in groups, maybe 5 or 10 minutes where they're comparing these 2, then I reconvene as a big class and we talk about comparing these 2 and perhaps categorizing them, evaluating them, having students talk to the whole class about whether they feel it's a logos approach, an ethos approach, pathos approach, and so forth, and maybe even talk about which one is generally more effective than the other. So after all of this, I am not going back into a lecture, you'll notice. This is where I've already done all that. I want to have students re-engage with the reflective process. And this can be done in the form of, say, a KWL strategy, which is know what you want to know and what you have learned. So at the beginning of class, they might talk about what they know or what they think they know about persuasive communication, what they want to know. And then at the end of the class, I'm asking them to sort of appraise what they have learned throughout those 75 minutes and to ask essentially, is the definition that you provided at the beginning of the class the same as the one that you have now? And chances are it's probably changed in some way. So I use reflection as a kind of bookending exercise on either end here. Now the last 5 minutes or few minutes I think is also really important. This is where, depending on your teaching style, you can re-engage with the icebreaker. For me, I don't tend to do that unless I feel like students want to. It's really important though for me to do two things. One is to debrief, like what was the purpose of doing these activities, looking at these videos, talking about logos, pathos, and ethos. I'm really wrapping things up with hopefully a nice, neat bow that summarizes and then serves as a transition or a preview into what we'll be doing for the next class. So this is kind of what I think responsible scholars do in writing, in the conclusion section. They're providing a summary of what they already talked about, but they're also looking forward in terms of future directions for possible research. And this is, I think, a really nice kind of thing that instructors should be doing as well. We're just kind of previewing what we'll be doing from class to class. It's in the interest of organizational, a sort of organized approach to communicating with your students. So you can really play with this structure here, but again, the idea is you're starting out simple with maybe basic tasks that address the lower levels of thinking on Bloom's taxonomy, but by the end of the class, or certainly by the end of the semester, if you look at it in that macro level approach, you're having students actually do some problem solving, comparing, analyzing, investigating, maybe even producing an infomercial of their own, which I often do in the next class after this one. All right, so let me now just spend a little bit of time talking about an alternative approach. So this is what's called the flipped classroom pedagogy. Apologies for the very pixelated upside down image, but this is why it's called a flipped classroom. The flipped classroom is really reimagining the use of class time and the roles of teacher and student, and this comes from Baker 2000. I must acknowledge that there's only one class in which I've done this, and this is when I teach linguistics. I'll get to that in a moment, but the flipped classroom is where we're really asking students to gain familiarity with course content, not in class, but outside of class. They might already be doing this because students study for an exam. They're going to be reading, maybe even looking at YouTube videos or like the Khan Academy or whatever resources they need to help them to understand a topic more effectively, right? But that's often used as a kind of supplement to what they're doing in class. Like it starts in class, but yeah, please check out this video, look at these readings after class, and then we'll talk more about this in the next class. Flipped classroom pedagogy is a little bit different because it's saying that you're going to get exposure to these concepts for the first time outside of class in the form of, say, brief YouTube videos. And this is kind of what I've done with linguistics. And this is the only class, admittedly, that I've taught with a flipped classroom approach, but I found it incredibly successful. But the only reason why it works for me in this class is because I have a YouTube channel where I already have a bunch of videos on all of the concepts that I end up teaching in linguistics anyway. So it then makes sense to then say, hey students, check out these videos, read this chapter in the study of language, so that what we're actually doing in class, I'm not lecturing at all. We're actually spending the whole 75 minutes actually doing problem solving, where they're looking at data from another language or their own language, and they're trying to figure out what's going on in terms of the sounds or the meaning of the words and stuff. So this is an example of what the flipped classroom pedagogy means. It just asks you to reimagine your role as a teacher. When teachers say that they teach, I think they often imagine themselves being the one on the stage at the front of the class, you know, with a whiteboard in front of them or a PowerPoint, and they're talking, they're lecturing, right? It's quite ironic that that's my title, is a lecturer, but that's the very thing I want to try to minimize in my classroom. So this also asks students to reimagine their role as well. I think many students are all too happy to serve as passive observers in a classroom because that means they don't have to do anything. They don't need to be put in this uncomfortable position of potentially having to talk to their peers or having to speak in front of the whole class. But I would argue that's exactly what we should be doing, especially in a discipline like communication or public speaking specifically. I can't just lecture to students about public speaking and expect my students to become better public speakers. They have to engage in the process. So the class time is not used for lecture really at all in flipped classroom pedagogy, but it's dedicated for problem solving and discussion. So I just wanted to present this model because it is something I'm considering doing with a class like public speaking, but I need to create more resources to be able to send students to those as the kind of first introduction to concepts like verbal communication, nonverbal communication, fallacies and argumentation, logos, pathos, and ethos, and all that stuff. But this is to say that there's not just one way to teach. You can really reimagine what you're actually doing in class, and that might not actually involve you teaching anything, but you're actually working with your students, and you're a guide on the side doing that, not a sage on the stage. But again, even though this is a presentation, I want to envision this as more of a conversation. So if you as a teacher, whether you're in the communication and journalism department or elsewhere on campus or around the world, and you have questions about this stuff, I want to talk to you because we're all in this practice of teaching, and that's really my focus. So I want to help, and I want to extend that conversation there. Again, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much. Have a great day.